All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning for those joining from the United States or North America. Good evening for those of you joining us from Asia. I'm Luis Simon, and professor and the director of the Center for Security, Diplomacy, and Strategy at the Brussels School of Governance. Welcome to our webinar on Sino-American Competition, regional security implications in the Asia Pacific. As you know, Europeans are slowly waking up to the strategic implications of China's rise and to the fact that the long-term strategic competition between the United States and China has become the sort of driving vector of international politics. European experts and policymakers, I would say, are perhaps particularly interested in how Sino-American competition may affect some of the key norms and institutions that make up the so-called liberal international order, such as the World Trade Organization, for instance. We've also become increasingly aware of how China's rise is manifesting itself in areas like trade, technology, or infrastructure development, and how its competition with the United States is also affecting those areas. However, the forest of Sino-American competition, if you will, can only be understood if we look beyond specific trees, such as trade, technology, or infrastructure development in Europe, and make an effort to see how the many trees of Sino-American competition hang together. And I would argue that it's particularly important to understand the evolution of the strategic balance in the Asia Pacific, which is probably the center of gravity of Sino-American competition. China is well aware of the fact that its global economic and diplomatic outreach will be hardly sustainable unless it manages to undermine America's strategic position in its immediate geographical neighborhood. That's how they see it in Beijing. And the United States is also, and policymakers and experts in Washington are also make the argument that the preservation of a balance of power in Asia is sort of the first line of defense of U.S. global influence. So in today's discussion, we're gonna zoom in on the mechanics of Sino-American strategic competition in the Asia Pacific, but also reflect a little bit on what all of that means for Europe and for European security more specifically. So we're gonna tackle such questions as how are China's advances in missile technology, cyber, and the space domains affecting the strategic balance in the Asia Pacific, and what role do the United States and its regional allies and partners play in relation to those challenges and domains. Also, how can Chinese hybrid warfare be countered, and what sort of lessons can Europeans learn from Asia-Pacific countries in that area, both in relation to China's influence operations in Europe, but also in relation to Russia's Russian forms of hybrid warfare, so to speak. And more broadly, perhaps, why should Europeans care about the evolving strategic balance in Asia? To address these questions, we've got a great lineup. We've got with us Thomas Manken, who is the president of the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments and a professor of international security at SAIS, Johns Hopkins University. He's a leading voice in U.S. defense policy debates and has been following the process of Sino-American strategic competition quite closely over the last few years. We also have Yifeng Tao, who's an associate professor at Taiwan National University and specializes on the link between economic statecraft and great power competition. And then we also have James Mackey, who is director of security partnerships at NATO and oversees the alliance's partnerships in the Asia Pacific, which is a topic that is gaining more and more attention, getting more and more attention in NATO circles as the alliance gears up for next year's summit in Madrid and begins to work on a new strategic concept. Now, each speaker is going to have about 10 to 12 minutes for initial remarks, and that should give us plenty of time for discussion and for any questions that you may have. The participants are not visible in this format, but you can use the Q&A box for any questions or comments you may have. Let's start with Tom. Tom, it'd be great if you could tell us how you see the military balance in the Asia Pacific evolving, and how recent developments such as the Afghanistan withdrawal or the AUKUS deal may impinge on on such balance. Also grateful if you could comment on the cross Taiwan Strait balance and the whole debate about the likelihood of Chinese military move on Taiwan, which is a lively debate these days. Tom, over to you. Welcome.
Well, thanks, Luis. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's a pleasure to be with everybody today. And yes, as requested, let me talk a little bit about the military balance in the region, and probably the best way to think about it, again, is within the context of Sino-American competition. The best way to think about the military balance is in terms of a competition between U.S. power projection on the one hand and Chinese efforts to counter that on the other, which goes by the variously called counter-intervention or anti-access. Really, since the end of World War II, U.S. strategy in the region has rested on forward-based forces on U.S. territory, on allied territory in the Western Pacific, backed by reinforcements from the United States and from allies. And really, over the course of decades, China has sought systematically to blunt that capability, to blunt the ability of the United States to defend its allies and protect its interests in the region. And again, I think particularly in retrospect, just how systematic that effort has been is apparent, and I'll say a couple words about that in a minute. I'd say the overall goal of China's strategy is twofold, with another goal that's, let's say, even stronger and but more aspirational. The first goal of Chinese military strategy is to force American military leaders, American decision makers to have to reconsider our strategy of power projection. Chinese investments in missiles, in cyber, in aircraft, in a whole bunch of areas really are meant to call into question the U.S. strategy of power projection. That's number one. Related to that, the Chinese investments and Chinese counter-intervention strategies really meant to impose costs on the United States, so much so that American decision makers would consider it unwise, not impossible, but unwise, overly costly to project power in the Western Pacific in defense of American interests, in defense of American allies. And then I think aspirationally, for the future, the Chinese leadership actually hopes that counter-intervention, that anti-access capability will be so awesome that it would actually, in fact, deny the U.S. the ability to project power. And I think from where we are in 2021, it's very easy to see in retrospect how systematically Chinese leadership directed resources towards solving for them the gravest problems first, and then kind of move from there. So if we go back to the 1990s and look at things from Beijing's perspective, the biggest military challenge they faced in Beijing was posed by theater-based U.S. strike aircraft. So based on allied territory in Japan, for example, but also on U.S. territory. And so we see the first set of investments that China made were really at rendering those bases inoperable in the form of precision-guided conventional ballistic missiles, first and foremost. And then next, I'd say next most threatening to China were U.S. carrier strike groups, U.S. naval forces. And then so you can see a wave of investment there at striking U.S. aircraft carriers, a real icon of American power, and U.S. warships. If you take away U.S. theater-based aircraft and naval aircraft and naval strike, surface strike, then from China's perspective, there the types of responses they would have to deal with in, say, should they take aggressive action against Taiwan would be much diminished. It would amount to our bomber force, our cruise missile force, and for China, that's an air defense problem. And now I think you see China moving on to other domains. So anti-submarine warfare, so to counter American submarines, space, cyber, and then building up China's nuclear forces has just been in the news in recent weeks. China has a major buildup of its nuclear force underway. So all that's been going on, since the 1990s. It's been going on in a dedicated effort to deny the United States the freedom of action in support of our allies, in support of our interests in Western Europe. But look, for much of the period that this was going on, the U.S. political leadership, or at least part of it, was distracted. Distracted by Iraq, by Afghanistan, by various other things. Fortunately, I would say, in recent years, there's been, growing. Look, there was always growing awareness in the U.S. security community. There was always awareness in the U.S. military. I'd say now, crucially, in the former administration, and now in the Biden administration, there is the political awareness of it and a desire to do something about it. So, the Trump administration in its national security strategy, its national defense strategy, put competition with China and Russia at the forefront, and that's been continued for the Biden administration, with a particular focus on China over Russia. And the U.S. military in recent months has been developing a so-called joint warfighting concept. And the idea there is maybe somewhat akin to what NATO did in the 1970s, 1980s with follow-on forces attack, and what the U.S. Army and Air Force did with air-land battle, provide an overarching concept for how the United States would think about dealing with a China that has these capable anti-access capabilities. And also more recently, the announcement of AUKUS, a very visible deepening of alliance ties between the United States, Australia, and Great Britain. And AUKUS is, in the first instance, about helping Australia acquire nuclear-powered attack submarines, but AUKUS is broader than that. It envisions a deepening of defense collaboration between the United States, Australia, and Britain in a number of areas. So I think all of those are signs of a growing seriousness by the United States, but look, a growing seriousness brought on by an increasingly dire military balance. And I think for a number of years, I think naively, many people in Washington thought that, well, that China and Taiwan, whatever differences there were, the military force was sort of a backseat, and that it was, political engagement, economic ties were really going to be the coin of the realm. Again, I think that was naive at the time, but I think it's clear now that the Chinese political leadership has really invested itself in confrontation with Taiwan, and so bolstering Taiwan's capabilities, and also being able to deter an attack on Taiwan, I think is an increasingly important matter. Same thing with Chinese aggressiveness towards Japan. So why don't I just leave it at that as kind of a scene setter, and look forward to the discussion to follow.
Sure. Thank you, Tom. I'm sure we'll come back to many of those points. I was also particularly interested in your point about how the Biden administration is clearly prioritizing China over Russia, which is perhaps particularly relevant from a European perspective, I would say. So hopefully we'll come back to that later. Dr. Tao, over to you now. Let's now try to expand the scope a little bit of the conversation and zoom in on the economic security nexus and more political forms of influence as well, in the context, of course, again, of Sino-American competition in the Asia-Pacific. Specifically, I'm interested in the question of how Beijing leverages its economic power to achieve foreign policy objectives, and also how the United States and its regional allies and partners are, in your case, specifically Taiwan, responding to Chinese economic and other forms of coercion. Over to you, and good evening.
Good evening. Thank you, Professor Simon. And it's really my pleasure to take part in this webinar. Yeah, I think the economic interdependence has really complicated the regional security issue. In comparison to the Cold War last century, I think the current competition between the US and China is different, at least in two aspects. First, China's economy is much larger than the former Soviet Union. And the second, China's economy has been deeply integrated into the global economy. Since China joined the WTO in 2001, China's GDP has grown by 12 times. Today, China is the largest trading partners for nearly 2/3 of the countries in the world. It is beyond disputes that China is the #1 beneficiary of globalization. However, the Chinese communist leaders have never hesitated to weaponize its massive market to punish foreign governments and companies when they are displeased. As China used it more and more often, it has cast a long shadow over the future of the global economy. So my presentation today is focused on how China has weaponizing its growing economic clouds. Some would call this kind of behavior coercive economic diplomacy. That is defined as the use of threats of negative actions to force foreign governments and companies to change their behavior to China's pleasure or advantages. They are including trade sanctions, investment restriction, tourism bans, and popular boycotts. I will first tell you about the political logic and the mechanism behind China's coercive diplomacy, and then to evaluate whether it works, and finally, to give some policy advice to countries who don't want to be coerced by China anymore. To understand why China would weaponize its market, we must understand how the Chinese leaders think of international trade. Unlike people in the open market economy, the Chinese leaders, they inherited a dynasty mentality. They see trade as a favor to the foreigners to be given in exchange for political loyalty. Once the foreigners display any sign of disobedience, China would easily retrieve the favor as a punishment. With this mentality of ancient dynasty, China always has a special mechanism to govern its foreign economic relations. Instead of granting universal market access to every qualified foreign individual or corporation, China would give preferential treatments selectively to a few lucky individuals or companies in particular sector, even though this violates the WTO rule. This particularistic practice has cultivated special interests in many business communities around the world who have lobbied seriously on behalf of China in their own countries. China's market is always a promising source of growth forecast for multinational companies. However, the massive market also makes its trading partners and investors easily fall into the trap of overdependency. Taking Taiwan as an example, 1 decade ago, China accounted for more than 80% of Taiwan's outbound investment and 40% of Taiwan's export. Over-concentration created a political problem for Taiwan, as the Chinese government would demand Taiwanese business people to publicly support its favorite candidates in presidential election. In the running up to the 2020 presidential elections, China abruptly announced the travel bans on Chinese tourists, the #1 source of Taiwan's tourism industry. Most recently, China has unilaterally banned the imports of Taiwan's pineapples, wax apples, and sugar apples to punish the ruling DPP party, which has strong support in agricultural area. This action was to retaliate Taiwan's efforts to improve relations with the like-minded countries recently. Under the leadership of Xi Jinping, China has become more nationalistic and aggressive in weaponizing its economy to more and more countries. Does it work? I would say it has its limits because China itself is on the other side of these interdependent economic relations. Sometimes the ill-designed economic coercion might function as a self-inflicted wound for China than a damage to its trading partner. Australia is a good example. The bans on Australian coal, barley, wine, timber, and lobsters since May 2020 has not only failed to make a dent on Australia's aggregate export, the embargo of the import of Australian coal has caused the shortage of the supply of high-quality coal that contributed to the recent sudden power outages in China. China's coercive diplomacy has emboldened Australia to play a more proactive role in the regional security issues. Likewise, China's tourist bans has made Taiwan's tourism business to finally rethink their over-reliance on the easy money made from Chinese tourists and started to diversify the market to other countries. A more sustainable countermeasures to offset China's market weaponization is to diversify and upgrade the affected countries' trade and investment portfolio. Australian government helped their exporters to find alternative buyers of their agricultural and minor products. In the aftermath of the SARS episode, South Korean corporations closed many of their China operations and headed to the Southeast Asia, dealing with the predicament of over-depending on Chinese market. Taiwanese government has started to support the Taiwanese enterprises to either come back to invest in Taiwan or to go to the Southeast Asia with the help of the government's new southbound policy. As a result, Taiwan's economy has been the fastest growing one in the region amid the COVID pandemic. Although China is still the largest trading partners to many countries in the world, after experience with China's coercive diplomacy, most of the countries nowadays have a second thought on their economic ties with China. According to the latest survey conducted by Pew Research Center, all the countries they surveyed except Singapore see more value in close economic ties to the US than to China. In average, 65% of the respondents in the survey say they think close economic ties to the US are important, but only 20% think the ties with China is important. The 65% for the US tie is an 30 to 40% increase from 2015. It is a very dramatic change. And when asked whether they would try to promote human rights in China, even if it will harm economic relations with China. Overwhelming majority of the respondents in this country answered yes. Finally, I will give some policy advice for countries who really would stand up to China's coercive economic diplomacy. Economic weaponization is most effective when the victim has to face it alone. If there are other markets or suppliers to turn to, then the weaponization will not intimidate its target. Just as the Tunisian Foreign Minister Gabriel Stenbergis once famously wrote on his Twitter that freedom-loving people should look out for each other. The free market has now become a public good for the like-minded countries to look out for each other and to protect any single actor from being threatened by China. When Japanese consumer bought the Taiwanese pineapple, it was not merely an act of consumption, but an act of solidarity. In a research report on this issue published by an Australian think tank last year, they suggest several concrete steps to counter China's coercive diplomacy and uphold global stability. I will share their advice with you here. First, to increase global situational awareness about the widespread use of China's coercive diplomacy and the most effective strategy to counter it. Second, to respond to coordinated and joint pushback to Beijing's sanction on 10 European politicians who are critical to China's human rights violation in Xinjiang. The EU Parliament almost unanimously voted to hold the ratification of the Sino-American Comprehensive Agreement on Investment until Beijing lifts the sanctions. And third, the Australian think tank also suggests the 5 I countries to adopt a collective economic security measure similar to Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty establishing in NATO. I think nowadays the AUKUS is trying to build this mechanism and gradually will include all 4 I countries and even Japan and South Korea. Fourth, to factor in the heightened risk of doing business and building economic relations with China. As China's economy is in trouble with the huge amount of debt accumulated over the years, aging population, and Xi Jinping's detrimental economic policies, more and more economists have predicted China's economy will fall into lost decades like Japan did 30 years ago. In the coming decades, China's economy won't grow as fast as the past 2 decades. More importantly, as the Pew Research Center survey shows, most people in the world have already been aware of China's coercive diplomacy and the potential risks and the costs of doing business with China. I'm quite optimistic. Together, the world can defy China's coercive diplomacy. I would like to stop here. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Tao, for bringing the question of economic coercion diplomacy into the picture. Well, I'm sure we'll come back to many of the points that you raised. Let's now try to zoom out of the Asia Pacific proper and think about how this process of strategic competition in Asia may affect security dynamics elsewhere, particularly in Europe. James, NATO is taking a growing interest in China and also in the Asia Pacific region to things that are not necessarily connected in NATO circles, although somewhat connected for sure. So I'm wondering, in what ways can Sino-American competition in Asia affect Euro-Atlantic security? What role, if any, can NATO specifically play in relation to China? And are we sort of witnessing a renewal of the debate around NATO as a regional versus global organization? And again, what role, if any, does NATO envision for itself in the Asia-Pacific specifically? Over to you. Good afternoon, James.
Great. Good afternoon, and thanks very much for the invitation, Luis. And thank you very much to the two previous speakers. It's always great when you participate in a panel and you actually learn something from the other panelists before you even start to speak. And I feel like I've already learned quite a bit this afternoon. So thank you very much. I appreciate the two starting presentations. I think that, so as you said, Luis, I'll try and address a little bit, what does this competition mean for European security and for NATO specifically, and how is NATO approaching the region, and how is NATO approaching China? I think we need to start from the standpoint of, despite all of the talk about a pivot and a shift and everything, that North American security remains linked to European security, and both sides benefit from this bargain. And that's not going to change. So, I mean, it's been that way for 70 years and it will remain that way in the future. There are always sort of changes in emphasis and changes in terms of where resources are deployed. But the fact remains that North America and Europe have decided, and I personally believe will continue to decide, to handle security challenges together because it's in their interest to do so. And they will use the NATO alliance, as they have for more than 70 years, as a tool with which to address those shared security challenges. NATO's mission is going to remain to defend the security of our allies, and that's always the focus or the lens through which we look at all of these things. And it's going to be no different when NATO looks at the Indo-Pacific, in terms of, we're not looking at sort of what can NATO do in the Indo-Pacific, but we're looking at how the challenges that arise in the Indo-Pacific are going to have an impact on our security and our ability to defend our allies. So let me just state right up front, in answer to your question about, is NATO shifting? NATO is going to remain a Euro-Atlantic organization. I think that's what we will get consensus on among our allies. But at the same time, I think NATO seeks to be, and NATO should be, an organization with global connections. And we need to have a clear understanding of the new security challenges that are coming up, things like emerging and disruptive technologies, space, and cyber, that these are not just regional challenges to security, they are global challenges to security. And if there are new standards being set, or there are new types of habits being formed in one region of the world, it will by default have an impact on everywhere else in the world. And I'll talk a little bit about that going ahead. So we really need to understand what China's development of new capabilities means for NATO's security. And that's what we've been doing over the last couple of years. We have some real concerns about a lack of transparency in development of new weapon systems, disinformation campaigns, and malign cyber activity. These are real concerns, and these are things that are having an impact on our security right now and our ability to defend our allies. So we need to think about them, and we need to plan accordingly. We also see opportunities to engage with China on things like the security impact of climate change, UN peacekeeping capabilities, and transparency and confidence building measures, especially and then eventually moving towards arms control. So I think we're very clear that we clearly see some challenges from China, and we need to address those challenges. That's our mission. But we also need to try and reach out to China and engage with them to talk to them about this shared global security space that we have, because they are an actor in that global space, and we need to understand their position, but also try and convince them that the methods we use problems is something that China can and should sign up to going forward. That the sort of rules-based international order, the norms, and eventually things like treaties and especially arms control treaties are things that have kept the peace globally for many decades now. And it's in China's own interest as a global power to sign up to these going forward. So we engage with China on a regular basis. to raise our concerns about these challenges we see, but also to discuss potential areas of cooperation. And this is one big reason why we talk to countries in the Indo-Pacific, but it's actually not the only reason that we're talking to the countries in the Indo-Pacific. We've actually had pretty long-standing partnerships in the region. These go back more than 20 years. Our 4 key partners in the region are Australia, New Zealand, Republic of Korea, and Japan. And we certainly have worked with them on operational cooperation in Afghanistan, but that actually has gone over 20 years much more broadly to include things like counterterrorism, counterpiracy, cyber defense, and resilience of our societies. These are like-minded partners that share our interest in supporting the rules-based international order, as I said before, as the bedrock of global security. And our work with these partners is not really about increasing NATO's presence in the Indo-Pacific, just as it's not about increasing, for instance, Australian or Japanese presence in the Euro-Atlantic sphere. But what it is about is understanding that many of the challenges we see, actually most of the challenges we see in our respective regions are in fact very, very similar. And there's real benefit in exchanging information and discussing where common approaches make sense. And all of us will need to think about, for instance, what climate change means for regional and global security. All of us are going to need to think about the norms and standards we establish and eventually arms control measures for things like autonomous weapon systems, the use of artificial intelligence in military activity, or military activity in space. These are clearly not issues which are going to have an impact in just one region. They will be global in nature, and we will eventually have to have global discussions on what we believe the norms, standards, and eventual treaties are that we need. And we certainly believe that working with our Indo-Pacific partners and bringing Europe and the Indo-Pacific together in the forum of NATO is a really good way to talk about these issues and try and come up with some common positions as we go into those discussions and as we go into that dialogue. So as I said at the beginning, I don't think that we will see NATO doing freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. It is and will remain a Euro-Atlantic organization. But we need to have those global connections, and we need to try and make those linkages between regional and global security. We need to start having these conversations now, because a lot of these challenges are coming up very quickly. And as Thomas said in his initial remarks, many of these things have been under development for years, but actually a lot of these systems are now being deployed in the real world. And so the conversation about sort of how do we handle these issues and how do Europe and the Indo-Pacific cooperate and discuss these issues is becoming very real very quickly. And so it's, at the end of the day, as I said, it's clearly this strategic competition in the Indo-Pacific is very important for the United States, but Europe has a real stake in this as well, as a global security actor itself, as a global economic actor, and as a global norms actor. I think the European countries and certainly the allies within NATO will be really focused on that and continue to ask us to engage in that type of work going forward. Let me go ahead and finish there and look forward to our conversation and questions. Thanks very much.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you very much, James. Thanks to all three of you. I see that we already have several questions. I don't know if you can see them, but I can. So otherwise you can. Okay. So we have 3 questions now. 2 from Octavian Mania from CSDS. For Tom, so Tom, it's about the third offset strategy. Where are we in the development of offset technologies to overmatch Chinese counter-intervention capabilities? More importantly, what progress did the US make in advancing with new operational concepts, new ways to operate within the environments that you alluded to? What we're going to do is just collect Then there's a second question from Octavian, which I guess is both for Tom and Dr. Tao, but James, happy if you want to pitch in as well. He's talking about the fact that the Japanese defense minister in the summer said that the peace and stability of Taiwan was directly connected to that of Japan. And he's saying that sounds like a de facto inclusion of Taiwan in the defensive perimeter of Japan. Is Japan on the verge of a paradigm change in the case of Taiwan? What role does Taiwan play for the broader military balance in the first island chain? I guess that's a question for both. It'd be great to get both the US and the Taiwanese perspective on that question. Then Tong Fi, Professor Tao, he's saying that he'd like to flip your presentation and ask how the Western democracies can weaponize their economic power to use it against China. So great point. Particularly interested in the speaker's assessment of how effective the prospect of economic blockade is in deterring a Chinese attack against Taiwan. Again, a big topic. More questions coming in from Ari Tatian for James. Would NATO be able to address the strategic concerns of the United States with respect to China? In other words, do the United States and Western Europe have common interests in security and strategy in Asia? I guess you've touched on that already somehow, but it'd be great if you could elaborate a bit more. And then Max Ernst for Professor Tao, but others are welcome to pitch in. At the moment, more and more Europeans are becoming aware of China's coercive practices. A lot of criticism relating to the treatment of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang and other minorities. At the same time, China will be critical in tackling climate change, and Beijing will probably leverage its readiness to cooperate on climate and tie it to Western European acquiescence on other critical issues, such as human rights or economic coercion. What advice can you give Europeans to deal with such Chinese issue linkage, so to speak, attempts, and how can we engage China on different issues simultaneously? So I have a few questions myself, but I'm gonna put them aside, and if there's time, we'll get back to them. So Tom, why don't you get started? There are a couple of questions there for you.
Sure, thanks. And those are excellent questions. So to Octavian's first question, I guess I would say that responding to Chinese counter-intervention capabilities is in part about technology, but it really is a lot about operational concepts and organization. It really is about how we're organized and how we think about operating. And there, I think you look at what each of the U.S. services has done in recent years. It's been to start to develop new operational concepts. So for the Air Force, it's about reducing the vulnerability of forces deployed close to China, or frankly, close to Russia. I mean, the concepts apply equally in the European theater. So to distribute capabilities to increase their survivability, but also to increase their lethality. Similarly, for the Navy, you have this idea of distributed maritime operations, so increasing the striking capability of naval forces while also reducing their vulnerability. And say notably, both the Army, U.S. Army, and the U.S. Marine Corps are getting into the maritime strike mission or the sea denial mission, and investing in land-based anti-ship missiles. And the Marine Corps really working hand in glove with the U.S. Navy, real complementary capabilities there. So I think you can see a whole host of efforts by the services. And then, as I mentioned just very briefly, this idea of a joint warfighting concept as a way of linking up all these disparate efforts, and then also to be able to identify the capabilities that are particularly important, and then also identify any potential overlaps in capabilities. So that really is something that's ongoing and something that I think is picking up momentum. To Octavian's second question about Japan, in terms of the importance, the geostrategic importance of Taiwan to Japan, I would just ask any of our viewers to go look at a map. The Japan Southwest Islands abut Taiwan, and so I think it's historically been the case that Japan's security is deeply tied up with that of Taiwan. I think it's but as Octavia notes, I mean, it is notable that Japanese political leaders have been willing to voice that. And I would say that, you know, Japanese defense modernization also in a way really takes that into account, again, with Japan investing in a new generation of land-based anti-ship missiles, among other things, to help defend sovereign Japanese territory. But in defending sovereign Japanese territory, it can't but help affect the defense of Taiwan. And I would also say that Japan's not alone. I mean, I think you've also seen in recent months senior Australian officials talking about Taiwan and the fact that you know, Australia has an interest in Taiwan, and that, you know, Australia would be forced to you know, to aid Taiwan should you know, should push come to shove. So I think that's, you know, that's all acknowledging the shifting military balance, but I think it's also a very necessary part of efforts to deter Beijing and deter increasingly provocative, aggressive behavior on Beijing's part.
Terrific. Thank you, Tom. Dr. Tao, there are a couple of questions in there for you as well.
Yeah. Okay. For whether there is a paradigm shift in Japan, besides what Tom has just said, I think there is a paradigm shift in East Asia, not only for Japan, for Australia, even for Vietnam and India, because after what happened to Hong Kong, although PRC has sovereignty over Hong Kong, but until last year, I think Hong Kong is still under the influence of Western capitalist countries. So what had happened in Hong Kong for the last 2 years is actually is kind of Beijing has really taken over Hong Kong. So many people have asked whether Taiwan will be the next. And the importance of Taiwan is not only because the importance of the Taiwan Strait as a very important sea lane for the international trade, but also because China has increasingly seen taking over Taiwan as a kind of a hegemony power transition war. That means if China can really take over Taiwan by military means under the eyes of the United States, that means the collapse of US hegemony in the region or in the world. So it's really a very really a catastrophe for US allies in the region. So we see this kind of a paradigm shift in East Asia. I think what happened to Hong Kong is very important to have this kind of a change. And for the second question, how could Western democratic countries to weaponize your system to China? I think it's really a very hard question, because for open society, how to weaponize an open society? Actually, for China, like Xi Jinping's close aide Wang Huning, he has wrote a book. The book's in Chinese, the book's name is "The America Against the America." That is when he went to be a visiting scholar in the United States. He observed in democracy, people just have a lot of open conflict with each other over different kind of interests. So he finds this kind of a system, from his perspective, is very inefficient. And he also finds, and nowadays the Chinese leaders find they can take advantage of it. So they can always just, in my presentation, they can use certain kind of a preferential treatment to cultivate a certain particular group and they will lobby for China, and that's how they make use of our open society. So I think for the democratic countries, the like-minded countries, we should try to defend ourselves by try to make us have more awareness of how China has weaponized this kind of economic cloud. There is economic clouds to seduce some groups in our society to lobby for them and make the public aware of this. That is my answer. And for the issue linkage for the European countries, I think the climate change is not only the Western countries' interest a problem, it's also China's problem. So I always don't see the reason why other countries should make concession to China when they have to do anything about climate change, because it is in their own interest to do something about the climate change issue. And they always make this a kind of deal to make with others, to have others to make a concession for them to do what they have to do. So I think we should separate the issues. I remember during the Obama administration, the US have tried to delink many different kinds of issues when they are dealing with China. For example, when they are dealing with Taiwan, they won't trade Taiwan's problem with other issues. They just separate issues. They just negotiate with the Chinese government separately, don't have the issue linkage. That is really a good lesson when you have a bargain with China over the years. Yeah, that's my answer. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Tao. I guess this is a very important point, that the question of issue linkage is unavoidable in a context of intensifying competition, and I think that's also very important for Europeans. James, in the meantime, you got a few additional questions. I don't know if you saw them. If you did, if you can just in a few minutes address whatever questions you can, that would be great.
Sure, thanks. And I know we're running up against the end of it. I feel like we could go on for another couple of hours here with these issues. But let me just first address the first question about, do the US and Europe have common interests in the Indo-Pacific? Absolutely. I mean, there are physical world interests in terms of, if you just look at the trade flows, if you looked that there was some sort of blockage or military contingency in the South China Sea, that would immediately have a global impact on economies around the world. So the idea that is somehow for Europe, that the South China Sea or the challenge across the Taiwan Strait is an over there problem, something that's not going to have an immediate impact on European security and economic development. You can't look at the numbers and not see that this will have an immediate negative impact on European security. So there is a very real common interest that Europe and North America have in terms of addressing this. But then I also, not to repeat what I said, but also in terms of thinking about the norms and standards we have for the emerging technologies. Like I said, I mentioned the use of artificial intelligence in our societies, especially if from a NATO perspective, the use of autonomous weapon systems and artificial intelligence in warfare. Those are things that sort of standards and norms that we set will have a global impact. Because if one country starts going down one path, then all of the other countries are going to have to respond. And so it's incumbent upon us to try and address these challenges now. And then in terms of, I really like what Dr. Tao mentioned in terms of, democracy is messy. Democracy with 30 countries around the table is even more messy. But I do think that it's incumbent upon us, if we want to stand up for the values that we believe in, if we want to stand up for our way of life and the international system that we believe has served us well, it's very important for us to coordinate together, even if it's very messy, to try and understand what we believe is the best way forward. I saw the one question about nuclear deterrence, and I do think that, you know, we're not at that stage yet where allies have identified that, because we don't see China as a threat to Europe and to the security of the alliance physically here now. But certainly, as I mentioned, we need to consider China's growing capabilities and also the way in which those capabilities are developed. As I mentioned before, not in a transparent way, not in a way which is trying to sort of move towards global norms or willing to engage in arms control discussions. And at the end of the day, NATO is responsible for defending the security of its allies. And as the global security picture changes, NATO is going to have to take account of new developments in the global security situation. So, thanks.
All right, thanks, James. Thank you very much. I must say I'm particularly frustrated because I wanted to ask a few questions myself to each one of you, but I'm afraid we're running out of time. And I know that all of you have very busy schedules, and also our participants, and we promised we'd finish by 3. So that's what we're gonna do, finish by 3. Fascinating discussion though. We're gonna continue to pay attention to geopolitical and strategic interdependence between Asia and Europe in particular at CSDS. So hopefully we can count on you in future events. It's been great. Thanks again to our fantastic speakers, and also to all of you for tuning in. And good afternoon / evening / morning to you, Tom.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.